Hello everyone, today we make a question and answer video that can commit the audience a bit more to Schwerpunkt and can in this sense make the followers interact more with, and that also probably will leave me some extra time for maybe for video preparation about certain topics. We can maybe start skipping certain manualistic themes and going more into depth of certain others. But anyhow, I don't think I will be doing them extremely often, but it's obvious that the more the questions will increase, which has happened as a matter of fact recently. On Schwerpunkt, I will have a substantial number of questions to answer. Obviously, I will select them. And today, I will be answering I don't know if he wants to be named actually, but he's a member and a follower, I guess, that with whom I have engaged into a very interesting conversation about the value of a specialistic or generalistic education, how it should be combined, etc. And we ended up talking about other interesting topics, and he posed me actually two questions. And given that now I have only these two, I will allow this, in the future maybe I will not even pick every single question, but now the questions are very interesting, so they're very well worth being answered, and they're also touch on very meaningful topics actually. So I start with reading the both of them, then we will go thoroughly into each one in order. So the first one says, question for you though, what should someone know when it comes to general history? Meaningful things about ancient or contemporary history, then semicolon, which I don't understand if it's a question or not, but it's not important. I will cover both options and say, is what is meaningful in history subjective, or are there definite things people ought to know? This question kind of relates to me saying your thoughts are interesting and perhaps should try writing it out and making it concise. Another question, recently I was in Waterstones, a UK bookstore, looking for history books I might want to read. The problem is there is just so many, and just reading the title, blurb and contents page sometimes isn't enough to get an idea of it, if it's worth reading or not. I guess a way to know for sure is to know who the author is, who is publishing the book, and what the reviews are. But if you don't know the author and the publisher is known for publishing both great works and mediocre ones, or you don't know much about the publisher as well, how do you know that the book is good for you? Well, these are very, very interesting questions. Also, they're easily linkable, and I wish I will go in order, but actually the first one, I would have gladly left it towards the end because it's very deep. And I'm sorry that I'm asked now by several members to be more concise, actually, and all I do is to inflate actually the volume of every single answer. But this is definitely one that you can't approach in much of a different way, in the sense that this question touches very deep, also not just historical but philosophical questions that obviously I will try not to digress in, but it's a bit the question that we all have. Both the questions are things I actually wonder myself pretty often. And I wonder what other people see them like, because sometimes on Schwerpunkt I begin to talk about such things and say, well, maybe this is my opinion, this is the way I see the matter, but maybe other people have gone past beyond. And I believe that my ideas in this sense are not particularly original. By the way, I tend to be a rather pragmatic person, even if I talk a lot. But even all this rambling is part of a kind of a deep, thorough reflection on something that can serve, and it makes me, wonder for effectively translating it into practice. So, as I was saying before, the first question stemmed from this topic, with this discussion we had about the value of hyper-specialization and also of generalist knowledge in history. We came to the conclusion that fundamentally group of specialists coming together and telling, according to, there are people, essentially the people who know the most about that specific topic, and confrontating are naturally, I would say, the best option ever. That there should be a kind of a general understanding of history too, and hopefully experts already should at least already have some general understanding of history. And in relative terms, this is obvious, right? Since if you start a university career, you start with a basis, with the manuals, and this is something that everybody does, and that also will serve to answer the second question that is partly related. So, a question for you: what should someone? Okay, meaningful things or contemporary history? Okay. First of all, answering to the first point, I don't really know. let's put it simply. I believe that there is definitely a hierarchy of events that are more important, as they've been more influential, etc. And obviously, the historical debate can revolve around whether, how important they were and how they were not, because much of the historical debate is fundamentally about this. Let's try to figure out what is the factor that basically influenced the most. In history, we search essentially for this relation, cause, effect. And since, unfortunately, most of the times we don't really have the evidence at hand, or we don't, effectively we lack sources, we don't know whether that connection existed, we try to, look around the point and see and trying to see to spot tendencies, let's say, that can help us in this process. So it's pretty obvious that an event like, World War II is definitely a much more important event than, a skirmish into, into 14th century Europe somewhere, which obviously we know very few about. So that can be a measurement, like, by sheer size, by sheer amount of influence. And I would say that history tendentially, there are many differences in interpretation in certain topics. There are topics of enormous importance that we constantly find out to be overlooked and not, and even the detail, as a matter of fact, is important. But definitely, since we stick to general history, that is the main goal, trying to understand how much influence a certain historical event had, and positioning this in a scale of values, which a value that is as not an easy task to do, because especially when you begin, and this is the main problem, I would say, because at the beginning you don't have a specialistic knowledge, you start from the general one. So if you never got, as it happened to all of us when we began, if you're not acquainted with this specific hierarchy. I remember when I was started in university, I had these problems, and I keep having them, and I had them before, and trying to balance out all the various significance you can find into an historical event, and to say, okay, this is more important than the other, and so on. And comparing is also pretty dangerous, because sometimes we go by analogy, right? We decide to say, okay, well, this thing kind of looks similar to another, so I just put it in this box. Then you open that box again, and you realize that it doesn't fit in. That you somewhat gave it an importance, or you framed that event into a folder that is not its own, and you want to redimension that. But that normally happens, in fact, when you go beyond that. So in general history, I think that every manual is meant to answer to this question: what is important? I personally read several manuals in my life, because I'm very curious about this generalist perspectives, and I realized that there are very different ways, even among specialists that are specialists in our fields, maybe, but they still write manuals, because who does write manuals after all, that have different approaches, have different um, narratives, that they even have different ways they write, or which events they try to highlight, because sometimes there are, I think, the greatest historians out there, those who are able to have this omnicomprehensive view. I mean, it's when you're at the very beginning, you have a similar tendency, because you don't have the elements to go far beyond, let's say, and therefore you try to reason in very theoretical terms. Then you get into something more meaningful, and therefore you find out that everything is way more complicated, and therefore all you do, which is also what, generally speaking, the academy is doing today, is to 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 tear down everything that has been built before, as if it was not important, or trying to stress this even sometimes very extremely relativistic ideas. Then when you go beyond, and I haven't arrived to that point yet, but still, I hope to be approaching to that point. But when you have, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 years of experience in that field, you can start saying, okay, I have this vision of the world. So it's as if you came back to the origin, the starting point, you said. And what is fascinating, I pointed out often, is that very often what it happens, that this path is cyclical, that something that you thought maybe at 18 is something that you're gonna think that you destroyed when you were, I don't know, 22. Maybe when you're 30, pops out once again and says, and you say, well, but that thing maybe was right after all. It wasn't poorly thought, and it happens to me constantly. It happens throughout the whole path, but this is the problem. Everything goes by stages, and especially for those who begin with general history initially, it's the main goal is, I think, the main need, the main is to find, the spring of knowledge, right? You want to find, as these questions seem to be about, actually, where's the element that I have to take into consideration to solve the equation, right? And to be sure that it's gonna be the right thing, and that's very. I'm not saying that the user now owns that perspective. It's very far beyond. By the way, I forgot to say that this user is a HEMA student and practitioner, so he's a person who studies even historical materials. So he's definitely acquainted to these problems already. But it happens sometimes that when you skip, I don't know, for example, whether this user is a historian or not. He's whether, but there is something I noticed with people who let's say do not have a general, formal education in that field. That is, maybe you love history, but you didn't study history at university, you do something else. And is that university is like a pain in the behind, actually. Let's be honest about it, because when you go there, you have to learn lots of things that at the beginning especially you are completely uninterested in, because at least my dream was to go there and starting to learn essentially what I wanted, or to at least to characterize a little bit more my path, to customize it a little bit more, so that I could deepen knowledge in topics I was mostly interested in. But after some time, after some practice, you realize that aside from the actual content of those topics, of those classes, etc., what matters is how able you are to space into different fields, because that's the real problem at the beginning. At the beginning, you even you're not even aware that there is so much out there. So you tend to make everything much simpler. You tend to think that there is, in this sense, an easy path, an easy way to go through that, and that it just takes to follow that line and everything is in order. Maybe, yeah, okay, you may not have the necessary orientation, because maybe you in fact didn't study much else aside from that topic, but empirically you can still fall in line and keep a track. But I believe that that even if you manage to go through that, the problem is that you still can't frame that track in the general path. And that's what, in fact, university, I think it's all about. Because let's be honest, in 5 years of history, university, you don't really know, you don't really learn much about history as you thought it would be. I mean, before starting it, I literally believed that you had to study tons of books and just to read history in a kind of an encyclopedical fashion. Then you realize it's just, at the beginning there are these manuals, and then everything gets a bit deeper, more specialized, and you perfection your critical skills, your research skills, etc. But what you're paid with is not actual quantity of knowledge, but the ability that you get in order to frame that knowledge and to understand it. So it's of dramatic importance for a general history to look at as many fields and perspectives you can touch. Let's say, for example, when I was I believe, especially when I began at university, I thought that I was much into a structuralistic interpretation of history, right? And that's part of that theoretical exercise that you make before knowing something. Because that's the definition of a student. You're ignorant. You go there to get some knowledge and to therefore to know something more after that. And then along the way, I realized that the ideal part was also very important. That it's the old debate between Marx and Weber, right? What is that counts the most, the matter or the idea, the spirit? And the answer is that in fact, even the schools of Marx and Weber weren't actually antagonistic, because their pupils even admitted that basically the two things constantly interfere on each other, and therefore, and it's very difficult, by the way, there are many, as you understand, as these, but also many other philosophical interpretation of how history works in this sense. So, in my opinion, general history should be mostly about getting the manualistic, even scholastic material right. I mean, you can't do without dates, for instance. You say, well, but dates are like the least thing in history, right? Well, this is what we have been we have been taught sometimes, but I don't think it's quite right. I mean, I think you should at least start from the dates. I mean, if you really don't have any, this is obviously an advice for a kid who is in school. Let's say, obviously, that's why I was saying, manualistic, but even scholastic, because even in a high school, objectively, if you look at certain programs, they're not so bad. It's just that they're taught so poorly that adults get not to know even the essentials, and this is dramatic in our times. That is particularly evident. So even starting from that is quite important. Restarting, there are many booklets that have this very synthetic, concise and effective way of telling history, like all these topics in a row with the dates, names highlighted clearly, and even memorizing them, learning by heart. It's a very good start, because and I'll tell you what, that is something that is consistently lacking in today's history teaching, I believe, especially at universities as well. It's sometimes, at least when the university I attended was like a bit of a snobbish attitude, like saying, like the professor saying, well, what do I teach? Dates? That's not for me, I tell you. And they don't even ask it to you at the exams, and that's bad, actually, because and I was one of the few who knew them, and in fact I passed well that exam because I had gained even that ability of thinking the thing in time and space. This is also fundamental. Time and space in general history. You can't, I believe, many people approach history in a sort of philosophical fashion, like saying, it's all about the concept, about the idea, Yes, and then they don't even know where an actual event took place or when, and you realize that even knowing those things, makes you grow closer to even what the local society and this kind of more structural view of society of that world was, and that's particularly interesting. So never underestimate the power of a manualistic approach. The idea of knowing I have to know all of these chunks before I select them, saying I want just to focus on this and then going on. Unfortunately, for many students, it's plenty of, many of them, they just study, very superficially this manualistic phase and then go straight into that hyper specialization that I was talking with the user about. And that's where disasters happen. Because then you have someone who is a hyper specialist, who maybe is extra good at that field and knows everything, but then is not able to frame that knowledge in and not really just in history, but in the real world. There are many historians who I believe have grown not much different from just clerks that just make this. They're able. They have earned this kind of intelligence for that specific mechanism, but they tilt if they go out of it, and it's embarrassing and it's very limiting. And this happens at many levels. It happens at many levels of history that at that point you realize that there was no base at the beginning, or there was no curiosity, no wish to look at history first in the big picture and then in the little one. Because I don't know, this is me actually. It's very subjective. I'm not saying that it's normal or even the best thing in the world. But when I went to and even up to now, actually, what I really care about is to learn more. I mean, aside from the mere let's say economical aspects, I don't know, people study because they need a degree for working and so on. But in humanities in general, what's the point of taking a degree and stopping there? I've met actually many people who take those 3 or 5 years in history and then stop even reading about it and pretend they are historians. That's not what historian means in the first place. There should be a continuous expansion of knowledge. And in fact, I must say that even though I've come now to grow actually pretty close to what a specialist worth of this name really is in my specific field, that incidentally I neither discuss very much into Schwerpunkt, pretty oddly also, because it would be fitting in a channel dedicated to military history. My greatest goal, my greatest dream is to learn more even about the general history of all the world, in all time in history. And because I'm curious, I think it's funny. I'm pleased by it. I don't know why to say that. I think it's cool to have this fresh new knowledge and being able now to maintain it to keep it with yourself, even if you tend obviously to forget things, but on the long run, but still shaping your mind, molding your mind in that way that makes it flexible, doesn't make it bogging down into fields that are just a few spaces away from the way it's used to dwell, but that manages to space. That for me is quite important, and that's why. And I haven't actually very much answered the question because, as you understand, it's pretty complicated. I would advise naturally a sort of very I would like even ideally or ideologically, even if you prefer, to space as much as you can. I mean, you should be able, in my opinion, to learn history from a strictly materialistic, structuralistic point of view, as much from a completely ideal, even ideological, spiritual point of view, and observe that these perspectives exist at the same time. And that's only when you acknowledge that they both existed at the same time, even if maybe who wrote about them were starting from different points of view and starting points and other educations and cultures, etc. You at least know that they existed both, so you are above them and you can decide when it's the case to apply the one, when it's the case to apply the other, and at that point, actually, in the process, you are also able to intertwine the both of them. On Schwerpunkt, I generally make this a lot. I mean, I always try to focus both on the material and on a spiritual dimension, because in many ways that's how you can interpret overall the history of the world. So it's difficult even to tell you should learn the most about great socio-economical dynamics or about thinkers and philosophers, because they were all the product one of the other. So to the second point in here, specifying what about meaningful things about ancient or contemporary history? Well, I think here, as I was saying before, I don't understand whether this is meant to be, like ancient meant like distant, and contemporary is closer history, but also in here we can go by approximation. It's obvious that ancient history, we call it this way, is has this great there are pros and cons in all of them. Ancient history is definitely inviting you to read its sources, because you have a few of them. They're literally all you have most of the times. Think about ancient history in a narrower sense. I mean, what about Battle of the 3rd century BC? You have literally those 2 or 3 sources, and that's literally it. And these sources are like a few lines each. Start already studying a medieval battle of the 13th century, and see a spot difference where you have still like tens of sources, and most of them frame the whole thing into a much complicated story. Now the reason is evident. So when you get to contemporary history proper, you take a topic like, I don't know, Vietnam War, and you say, there is effectively no real expert in the world about the Vietnam War in detail as such, because the whole Vietnam War has produced so many sources that I think quite easily surpass in quantity what is being written about the whole ancient and medieval history combined. So at that point, it's a wholly different approach, and contemporary history has this great challenge. But contemporary history is also a virgin soil in many ways, because at that point you can pick way more easily different topics, many topics that nobody has studied, at least in great depth. So it's much easier sometimes, and that's also why now this influences our society, because naturally we live in a moment in which society is overwhelmingly complex, and it's always been the case in historical times, but even before. But it's obvious that the data that we have now about the last 100 years, for instance, is a universe you can get yourself lost in. You could even separate that from all the rest of history and dwelling into it with a thorough education. And consider also now the structures of education, the patterns we didactic patterns that we use are, I think I'm pretty traditionalist in this sense. I mean, I believe I was born in at this point in the 20th century, and I feel, I mean, I was one of those kids who grew with paper and pencil still, even if I used computers, etc. But my mind was still oriented towards that, and times are changing and changing fast, and that's why the reason I believe to one of the few lucky generations that saw both of these forms of education, and that owns the responsibility, by the way, consequentially, to try to form a bond, and not to let the education go to rewrite it from scratch, and simply not listening to the past, or for the traditional methods of teaching, not to take care of the new ones. So and that's part of the point that I was making before, that you have to manage to handle a bit of everything in this sense. So because you can combine, you have several tools, and maybe you don't know how to use thoroughly in their perfect way, in the most perfect way, but you're still able to know that there are, and that you can use them, and that they can work, and that their combinations are all yet to be explored. So it's very, very important. So when it comes to contemporary history instead, I think the most important thing is, even in here, maybe to use more kind of structural means, statistical data, using a greater meter of measurement, I would say. I don't know how to say that, but it's obviously also depending on what you want to learn, because the general here may mean so many different things that it's basically impossible to and there is dramatically also the interest. This is general history, but you still have to be driven by something. I mean, even a generalist education has to be aimed to something at a point, so it has to narrow down to a sort of specialization. I'm not aware, actually. I would gladly like to be one of those people at this point, but I still don't know of a specific form of education that makes you contemplate to know everything. I mean, those are people that we have lost, I believe, in the 17th century, and that now we reason very differently from. Obviously, at the time there was much less to know, but it's a form of education that doesn't exist proper. But frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if in a recent, in a very close future, we will have now to rethink our education on those bases. That is, to know a bit, first of all, at one, which is already what school is meant to do. But now, since we know much more, obviously we need to be able even to give the tools to frame, not just the sheer knowledge, because that's what's being criticized about the traditional way of education that otherwise I tendentially support. I believe that now the problem that we have is not about the contents of the topics that we teach, but actually about the way we teach them. I mean, even the quality of teachers proper. Let's be honest about this, because I think great disasters are done even by in the education of teachers. But aside from this, it's obvious that exactly for this reason, it's way easier to teach someone to learn something by heart, and then you deal with that. You make that person deal with that, and you don't care about whether that person has fully understood or is able to frame that information. And that's what is mostly criticized about our current educational system. I believe that in this sense we should invest way more into the education of teachers. There should be a greater selection, also a greater competition, incidentally. So, I mean, conversely, and the awareness that probably a huge amount of our future depends on how well we teach our students. And this is not really rhetorical or anecdotal, because the great problem with, I think, the discussion with the user started with was, and which I didn't explain clearly to him, is that we actually would have the means to give the kind of general education previously. As I was saying now, it's what school is meant to be. But unfortunately, it's not. So it's a great problem. I mean, you realize it in your in your education that there are people where you would think that education works well, but it doesn't. At every grade, whether you talk about school or university, you always find someone who lags behind consistently, structurally, and that mostly depends from what that person is being taught, or hasn't been taught in the previous grades. And how do you explain that? I mean, it's the person is stupid, or the teacher is an idiot. It's always the same problems, by the way. But we could fix that in ways that are way less complicated than they seem, apparently, and that would make us save, as a society, an enormous amount of resources that we could reinvest in for our wellness and improvement, and etc. So this is what is general history. So I would say that even a normal manual, reading several manuals at once for when it comes to general history, is not bad, because at least you know that it's like a seed. Once people tend to skip manuals, right? Because they're boring. But that's the greatest mistake. That's where instead you should really have everything clear in mind, and nobody usually does, because remember this lagging behind I was talking about right now. Well, the first grades are exactly the ones in which that problem causes the most damage, because that's at the beginning when even teachers excuse students by saying, oh well, they're young now, they will be able to fix that lack of knowledge to recover to. And effectively they don't, because grades keep going and keep passing, and that chance to learn the basis is increasingly diminishing in the process, and that person remains with serious problems without those with these gaps, let's say, that at that point you can't really fill, because the individual in the meanwhile has developed and has formed itself, and the more it goes on, the more it's difficult to reshape him and to fill those gaps. So it's particularly complicated, and it all starts from setting the basis right, because let's be honest, we have created a hell of a civilization. It does work well, it has all the potential to work well. Our problem now is commitment, is a sense of purpose, and we see it that one of the greatest problems of our society now is effectively lack of commitment and depression. If people do not find purpose, they think they're useless, they shelter themselves because they're not taught to have moral resources to be able to fight, to go there and to have a motivation, right, for it. And that's where you should hit hard, but this opens to also other topics that are too far from the one we decided to talk about today. There, however, we open with the other point of the question, which is, we could talk for like ages for this and never stop objectively, which is what is meaningful in history subjective, or are there definite things people ought to know? This question kind of relates to me saying your thoughts are interesting, perhaps trying to make it out and concise. I won't be concise, I'm sorry about that. I can't be concise, because this is one of those questions that you have to make an effort of you have to take a leap of faith to accept in if you want to find an answer. Personally, I believe that definitely history by definition is not objective at all. yet, and this is in theory. In practice, I would say that history is, let's say, the truth is definitely not subjective. This is particularly important in my opinion. History is always subjective. As we were saying before, in order to learn, in order to start to learn history, you have to have a purpose that normally stems from curiosity and from personal interests that are obviously and evidently subjective. It's obvious that human beings share a great deal of things in common as even as individuals, in that we have tendency to focus at least on certain topics that even are politically or socially relevant, and that empiric way of finding out which is the actual hierarchy of importance is something that I think our society in itself has more or less gotten right, at least in the academy, or where we talk about scientific history, scientific works, etc. History is subjective, but the problem is that truth is not. The truth is objective. And there is this great problem that is in a nutshell the problem of all humanity, that we know that we live in an objective world. At least, okay, even physically speaking, you can come to criticize that, because we realistically, or whatever it means actually at this point, we have no idea of why we are in the world that we are, that functions in the way it does. Physics basically tells us how things work, but not why. We don't even know what gravity is fundamentally. We still haven't found out, but definitely we know what its the effects of gravity are. What are the consequences of living in a world with gravity? So this is a bit a question that has to deal with the paradoxes of our own lives. We know nothing about how things work, but still we make them work for our needs. So it's obvious that what people ought to know is largely defined by what they wish to know, and therefore by approximation I would say that and I treat historical accuracy pretty or better, not accuracy but just in itself, but I believe that there is a history that you can frame in some pattern. I deeply despise in many ways the disconcerting destruction, every kind of categorization or order, or that is being done in our academies. There are entire fields of academic research to define what is acceptable as a definition or not. And I would say, okay, that's interesting, that's clever, that also opens your mind, that's one of the things you should learn. But still, if you want to profit from history in our life that is normally kind of economically regulated in the etymological sense of the word, you have to accept certain a level of approximation and categorization. Therefore, you can outline a sort of hierarchy of things that matter, things that do not matter. For instance, the great macroscopical socioeconomical evidences of mass society, let's say, are very important historically speaking. How can you understand a process like the world we live today if you don't understand how the world worked from an economical socio-economical point of view in the last, after World War II? It doesn't make any sense. You should be able to realize that that's important. You can't even come as far to say that that history matters in a political fashion. Definitely, I believe that everything has a political influence in the first place. I mean, you don't need to have to be led by a political ideology to influence politically the society in which you live. Even things that you buy influence what policy is going to be about. So history is, you can think of a history as a tool in this sense, even to propose some narratives, to make people reflect on certain aspects of our lives that matter, that things that happened in the past that happen to be similar or comparable to what happens to us today, which doesn't mean that history repeats itself, which I don't think so, for example, or at least, but it's just a matter of perspective. It depends really what your goals are. And therefore, I believe that teaching people that history is kind of all subjective, that somehow you can flip everything as you wish, just because to make people freak out and blow their mind. It's not really the best way to profit from history. That's a fashion, that's a taste that you have in the first years when you get acquainted to so many new things that seems so cool to do something like that. But the more you go on, what you're able to do is to find a narrative that actually fits what you have followed. I personally, and it's like finding out something you can't see visibly, but you can start to understand the way it works as a narrative. It's particularly interesting when you study a topic for many years, and the more you progress, you realize that okay, it's all way more complicated than you thought, and basically your greatest achievements are the ones that you obtain when you realize that you can't go further in a certain point because you have hit the bottom in this sense of the topic, and you find people around who still claim things that that go far beyond that boundary that can't be passed because there is no evidence, and you can start saying, okay, well, I know that I don't know, but it's at the same time it's because I know certain things that I've seen that's the limit more or less that exists, or at least that there have to be other ways to pass around that obstacle, because frontally it's impossible. So it really happens bit by bit, and adding information, adding knowledge, and being able to frame, to outline. So it's also the great problem of is it more what's more important, sources or historiography? That's quite an interesting question. Let's leaving aside that it's very difficult sometimes to actually understand what's the difference between the two, because most sources are, especially written ones, are definitely historiographical by themselves. They are historical works written by historians or by people who were telling you history, and by the way, trying to answer more or less the same questions that you try to answer today about your own society, for example. So I can tell you personally, I'm way more about sources, but this is banally because I study medieval history, and even in a period in which sources start to be very difficult to, in the 14th century, where they're very difficult to control, to check all, and to because I believe that the source is not filtered. I personally think that the greatest problem, aside that even the source can be filtered because you should be able to learn it from the original language, and still you need a lot of maybe of background to understand a specific source, etc. But the greatest problem I believe that happens with the general public and pop culture is exactly this one. That is this barrier that exists between knowledge that is even very commercially put out there for the general public, a commerce that is meant to make the public bait on the base of their ignorance, and what the real source is. Because I personally, this is about my personal character, I never trust, until I don't see what's the matter by myself, I never trust what people say, even if they're the greatest experts. Of course, I have my hierarchy of reliability in my mind, but I'm still convinced, having read now several books about also of historiography, etc. But in terms of especially my about a single topic that eventually I came to look at myself from the sources, I realized that every book, every study is just reading the question through someone else's mind, which is something I personally hate. And that's why I also have great problems when you say you have that I should hopefully be concise. But there are certain things that you can't really be concise about, because this is a very complex problem that needs to be explained, even with this experience. That sometimes experience, people want to often go to the theory, all pre-packed and all, but most of our knowledge now in our world stops even to empirical experience by a certain measure. There are certain patterns and narratives that you can draw, but still, even first-hand experience is particularly important. I can tell you that the experience is like this, and personally, I think that the greatest obstacle I've found now to trust, to have a kind of an objective view of history that obviously I can't have, is exactly this one. That when you get to know the sources and you read what other people have written about them, you realize that most of historiography is all about answering questions. Reading questions, reading answers for questions that you have not asked most of the times. That's why my advice essentially is read the sources first and then go to historiography when you need to know about a certain thing, because obviously there are answers of questions that you want that you're interested in, and of course you have to use them, but they should go in parallel actually, because if you focus just on the interpretation, you get too much subjectivity. But also in here, to frame the sources in a kind of an objective list of things to learn is practically impossible. On the other hand, it's definitely important to stress at least that once you get into this process, what is something that you can more easily find what are those definite things people like to know. For instance, an example in literature, what about the classics, right? The classics, historically speaking, are fundamentally works that have been filtered and selected through time for some reason, and most of the times this reason is that they were great works, right? So what unfortunately happens is that there are always the classicists, who are people who basically create a canon, and they say, it's only about the classics, the rest does not exist. That's a very stupid idea of thinking. I personally don't believe that there is, in this sense, a classic or not a classic, because, or better, the classics exist, but there is not a canon that you should always follow, which means it's a bit like historical sources. There are sources that are obviously more important, and there are topics that are kind of more important, more relevant for us, for our society, etc. But this doesn't mean that there are certain specific thinkers that made you understand that, and that you you can't do without, because somewhat they got it all. Because historical sources are always, if not endlessly interpretable, which is evidently not the case, unfortunately, most of the times, because sources have limits, but they're still frameable into different patterns that other people had not thought about. And we are at a time in history where these patterns are, still plenty of them, and you still can play with them, as long, obviously, as there is an interest of this kind. For instance, I'm writing now a work that is pretty hefty, and I'm realizing that many things of what I'm studying have been discussed sometimes already, and even with a certain degree of completion, but that still there are questions about it that have not been answered, that there are perspectives that these things have not been observed from, and that's what our work goes like. And there, of course, now this is a kind of an advanced stage of historical inquiry, but so we approach that hyper specialism that I despise myself for, even though I'm doing the same, but it's because it still helps, however, to frame the general, and that's only true, paradoxically, through the hyper specialization you can frame the general, and it's only through the general that you can frame the hyper specialistic. So basically, it's as if you couldn't do without, and therefore I think that what we have socially found out as a system of education, aside from its flaws, which come from individual, the varying degree of individual commitment, actually work. I mean, follow the direct tracks, keep the, even kind of modulate them on your own needs and interests and subjective motives, but follow some logic that is able to compensate, to balance everything out, if you can. That's the real challenge, and the important thing at that point is not even reaching the perfect balancement, but just approaching towards it. I believe that's the really important question. Then getting to the second question about the bookstore, and where you enter a bookstore and you wonder how, should I choose books not knowing their contents in here. So, by the way, I googled the Waterstones bookstore, and it looks actually pretty large, consistent one with quality books, etc. It's it's a good place, definitely, probably to choose books. This could also open to another topic, that is which books are sold, or better, which books are convenient to be put in sell, and why this happens. So unfortunately, there is a much bleaker picture than often the promoters of the so-called cultural activities would like us to learn. Actually, publishing today is very political. It's always been, but there are many reasons why such things happen. Publishing are all about money and interest, etc. So I'm for starting to read things from every possible. I mean, we have the internet today. We're not in a time in which we need actually to rely solely on actual books. I mean, it's obvious that you can buy them on the internet or whatever, but this question is pretty meaningful because it's obvious that books normally are, especially the ones that you have to pay for, and that therefore you may not have the the will to do, or to spend money, etc. Are kind of the most valuable pieces, containers of information, right? And there are also those memes that look, what Wikipedia is like the top of the iceberg, and all the submerged part is books and how we. It is true. It's largely like that, actually. But first of all, and obviously, but this is not really a question to the comment. It's plenty of books you can find everywhere, in the internet. But secondly, I would say that you don't just need books. That there are several ways you can understand how to frame knowledge, the knowledge that you find, and even through observing how people behave on the internet, or what they care about, what they don't. That's pretty interesting. I wanted to make a video recently, actually, about my internet forums and groups experiences. That it's extraordinary from an historical point of view, and that actually sparked my interest even in this apparently more theoretical topics that, however, are very concrete, and that's exactly where people who want to sell information and knowledge today are investing in trying to understand the psyche of people. That's why even social networks are so important, so vital in our lives, because they show our tastes, our interests, our dreams, and we depend on them, and it's plenty of gold in there you can dig. But we'll talk about this another time. Now the question is actually a bit specific, because okay, the user here lists all the elements that you can intelligently, all the elements that you can use in order to understand whether this book is worth reading or not. So the title is obviously, you should be looking for something that suits your tastes, and the title is it's something very easily the title, if you come across a book, of course in a bookstore is a different story, but I believe if you have a great interest in a certain topic, the quickest way is obviously to Google that and to go look for that book. Otherwise, if you look at the title, you say, okay, obviously you should avoid to in general to read this extremely, it also in here it depends completely from your from your interests. Do you want a general introduction to a topic? Choose a generalistic title, which is plenty of. You want something more hyper specialistic, go for it. I mean, if you find it. So the title is self-explicative, but there are not many tricks you can use in here. My my general advice is never to buy a book that talks about alleged revolutions happening, especially when they're connected to kind of great, like, aside, okay, if you talk about the French Revolution, it's fine, but the great modern revolution, the revolution of firearms, has never been, as a matter of fact, a revolution, bro. That's an extremely abused world that is used for affect reasons, for emotional reasons. It has nothing to do with it, and I can't tell you stay away from those things, because they're dangerous. They're cancerous. Actually, great part of today's societies come from that kind of a sensationalistic and / emotionalistic effect on the public. And many generalistic publishing are based or on such approaches, like, flashing you with this either good pictures and amazing titles and resounding titles and etc. They're not so good. There is a tendency even today to approach, obviously, much from a visual point of view, right? Especially in the age of when you have a screen in your pocket at all times, it's very easy to attract you with such promise that if something looks good, it's also great information. Sometimes it's true as well. I mean, it's plenty of publishing that is publications. Sorry, I didn't mean publishing. Publications that can afford good visual content, because they can can afford also good knowledge, and this is the case of many periodics as well, that they focus on this approach. They search for talented artists and so on. So also in here it depends, but and especially when it comes to military history, well, that can be important, because also the visual approach is quite important. But unfortunately, what happens in today's world is that lots since we're on average all kind of a bit well off, and everybody can post and publish and put out there whatever they want, it's happened that there is a proliferation of kind of facsimile, I would say, publications that kind of just good or sound or look good, that however the only great investment they made was in fact in disappearance, right? In this sense of it's like Hollywood movies. Look at what Hollywood has become right now. It's either about sequels or kind of disaster stuff, all action, kind of all the same type of characters, same type of stories, of emotionalism, even of tribalism at this point, and that's it. They're cheap, they're superficial, they're not meant to make the people think, but just to consume it quickly. And consuming quickly is not a good idea if you want to structure something solid and long lasting, etc. This is also another great problem of our lives. And intellectually it happens in the same exact way. At the same time, we shouldn't complain more than much, meaning that it's plenty of very good stuff that is easily accessible. The problem is sorting that out, which is what this question is asking for. Also, browsing to the pages is something that can help. I never enter in bookstores, because now I have something like almost 10,000 books on my own. I haven't read them all, of course, but sometimes I don't even know what they are about, so I go search for content that I can. Most of the cases I have, especially when it's about military history, stuff like that, and 10,000 books is not even this huge much, actually. But it happened last, and I don't enter in bookstores personally because I believe that in fact the knowledge is becoming too commercial for my tastes. But I entered, I think it was maybe last year, I don't remember, that I entered in a bookstore because there is a book published by some, written by some authors, one of which is incidentally becoming my colleague now. I have to work with him, so I was interested in reading this thing, and but I was a bit skeptical because I know what that topic normally, those contexts normally about in that case, and I just browsed to the pages and I said, okay, this is cheap stuff. It might be well written, might be a thing, but it's just a re-edition of something that essentially we already know, especially in history. It happens all the time, that adds maybe just a bunch of stuff that has been found out from some archive, but doesn't change the whole thing. And that's why you have to be to pay attention even to titles. At that point, obviously, I knew what it was written in there, because I had read lots of other books about the topic, and I had the knowledge of why that was the case and why I didn't want to read that. But even when something is too there is also a matter of order when we talk about general content, because you may take this example as an example of me searching for something more hyper specialistic and therefore refusing a generalistic content. But it's not exclusively about that, because even the generalistic content needs its own philosophy, its own logic. It's also very disturbing sometimes of how some generalistic topics they're presented in that package because maybe it's more seducing for the buyer, for the person who knows less and thinks, oh wow, this is about this topic, I want to take it. Then you start reading it, you realize that it's all chunks of different, relatively specialized topics that are brought together by several authors to make this book, to make money, and what you leave that person with is maybe even a good book, don't get me wrong, but still a pretty confused view about the world, so that you know a tiny chunk about certain specific topics, but you still you know that's already beyond the generalistic level about which you don't know anything in turn. So most of the times the problem today is becoming, making all these collages, all these patches of stuff that more or less look like something presentable, and not giving a damn about the utility, the kind of even social usefulness of that product, of that read, because there is no philosophy behind it. It's very easy to take it's like even how in call for papers is done today. There is this call for paper, the university makes money out of it. It's how it works, and you invite a bunch of people who don't know anything about each other's work. They all tell their stuff, and nobody has a comprehensive separately, by the way, so that none of them knows much also about what the others are talking about, and there is an audience, and the audience gets these people might be some great scholars, etc. They know their business, they're so present, but that public keeps lacking the general picture. Okay, if you frequent like tons of those call of papers as a spectator, maybe you learn something new, but still there are people who keep doing that for all their life and still don't have a solid base from which to start in the thing. It's like reading many different books. There are people who read all their lives and still don't have a structural view of the world, because they lacked a base that could easily recover. I mean, I'm not telling you if you didn't have that base at 18, you can't have it at 60 by, no, absolutely not. It's also something relatively easy that you can start building up. But it's you have to be taught to learn, which is something very different. And that's why it takes an effort to do it. That's why there are universities, there is that stuff. And then unfortunately that's also where money come into the play, where there are interests, where people do basically all what is commercial, which is not bad, in theory, but it's not really aimed at, it's really not something should be taken as the exact response to a greater structural interest towards that specific topic. It's like it's a very primitive way of, and in my opinion, by the way, it's also anti-economical, because if you write a great book that really makes its time, and you're gonna in which you explain a topic in all its entirety, from its in depth and in general, so in detail and in essence, you can make a time. You can make a book of a lifetime, let's say, and making certain change. But in today's world, seriously, what is something that is meant to remain for so long? What is that is truly classical, that truly helps us all understand altogether what this is all about? A very few. I mean, up to a few generations ago, there was that one book that really meant the world to anyone, that we still read today, because that was that great omnicomprehensive mind that produced this thing. What about today? Today we don't have anything like that. You don't have you can't have an author, a scholar that is particularly famous or appreciated or popular, maybe has many followers, that has a great enjoys a great consensus appreciation, and maybe that makes also some good disclosure and approaches the general public to certain topics, but how many of these people actually leave a mark, aside from the sympathy of the individual? And what about the conception behind that? That is particularly important, because this is happening in our civilization at an alarmingly systemic scale. It's not just a coincidence. It's not that we will wake up tomorrow with a new Kantorovich or some. And it's pretty problematic, let's say. And obviously, this also has to do with what the masses remember about that. But that's why the classics are generally, they keep living on. And by the way, this is particularly important now. Regarding books, it's plenty of books, even on the internet, that are open source, that have been written now some time ago, like in the first half of the 20th century, even in the 19th century. You say, oh well, but those are old books, right? Yes, they are, but it often happens that actually those rights are way more useful than you imagine. There is this tendency today of saying, everything that is old is now it's outdated. It doesn't work anymore. It was so prejudiced. Then you read those books and you say you can't spot the prejudice. You can't spot what this person wanted to get to, etc. But still, overall, these are still hell of great works, and who does read them anymore? And instead, if you go to university, you're bombarded by tens and tens of articles, and article counter article, essay, and so on, and you lose and you go insane. That's a great problem, even for PhD students. I mean, it's literally a mess to browse into all the bibliography that you need to write a PhD. It's impossible today. At the time of our professors, it was like there was only one book or two you had to read. Now you basically can't even finish in the whole PhD to read everything, and you're confused, and your brain is biologically not made to cover all of these, to process all of these informations together. It's such a short amount of time. That's why people go hyper specialistic, and why they go insane in the process, because all they care about is to write all what the others have not written, not what they really want to learn about or to write about, to know about. It's like doctors today, that they don't care about fixing things. They care, first of all, of doing things that for which they can't be sued legally, right? And it happens everywhere. And I tell you, I come from like my family's doctors, so I don't have anything against doctors actually, but it making you the case, because it's a problem even for the professional that works in this field. So that's why what I would like to tell with all this is that there are many options, that there is so much open there, that all it takes to is to go out there by yourself. Of course, you need some parameter, right? Here to go on, we were telling, for instance, about browsing in the pages, and that's pretty useful as well. You can quickly understand from a book how it's written, what's the language, if it has citations in it, if it refers to other books, if it expresses itself in a kind of a complex fashion. Another thing that is worryingly lacking, in my opinion, in our world, is the ability of, first of all, writing. I think that writing is possibly the most important thing ever, because people are gonna read, I believe, more than, especially when they're gonna learn something, they're gonna read more than they're gonna listen to or watch. So writing is of excruciatingly importance, and people are lacking the ability of doing it. But in the process, they're lacking the ability of reading as a consequence, because they lose the ability to formulate before the process. If you can't formulate a complex process, how can you understand that? How can you interpret that? There is a great problem of communicability in our own world. That's why it's also particularly difficult to understand each other when For instance, I'm asked to be more concise. I realize it's very important. I know that, but I feel sometimes that there is this need to everything to be kind of simple, quick. Everything that is consumed quickly, easily, that you have to check. But it takes time before processing certain concepts. It takes a lot of patience. It gets a lot of exercise. And my hope is also to revive, in this sense, a bit of that complexity that we have taken out from our. For instance, now I also have problems of time. For instance, and I've been used now for more than one. I've used for more than 1 year to write a description for every single video I make. And it turns out that now I have a few time to do it. In fact, I'm lagging behind with several videos that had not happened previously. Why? Because this is how the market works. That it pushes you to be quicker, more effective. And I would like to be instead a bit slower, but a bit more poignant in my statements. And I say it myself because I'm also kind of I don't provide this extremely deep information, as you understand, but I still would like to present a method, or at least to present a way to do things more complexly, so in order to get more results at one time. So that's particularly important to me. As the author of the question rightly points out, even looking at these details is not enough to get an idea whether that book is worth reading or not. So the author says, I guess a way to know for sure is to know who the author is. So who is publishing the book and what the reviews are. Yes, absolutely, this is important. Also in here there are some precautions you have to take, because knowing the author is important, but at the same time you also have to understand, in fact he says afterwards that there are certain authors that are produce both great works and mediocre ones, and that's exactly the point I wanted to make now. I know several authors who, when they get commercial, they make rubbish. And instead, you say, "Oh well, this author sucks." Then maybe you find him in some study, in some academic work, and you realize that he had written something meaningful and deep, etc. And that's where you realize where's the watershed, right, between the commercial stuff and the thing that really is thoroughly researched and has something to say, etc. That could be commercial, but guess what? It takes a much greater effort. And now, as I was saying before, I believe there is a sort of giving up, a defeatist attitude in the market, in the people. That is to take everything immediately and quickly. But if you waited for some time more, maybe you would, or if you paid, because this is also time is probably our most precious resource, you can have something much better. It's like with movies. Sometimes I don't understand. They make certain movies. I'm all about. I would like my greatest dream is to make a historical movie, and I watch. I actually don't watch much of modern movies. I never go to movies actually. I don't remember even was the last time I went. But sometimes I watch even on YouTube, etc. These clips, etc. And I say, these people spent so much money to make a historical movie for many other reasons. But if they had spent the same exact amount of money, so not a cent more actually, to make the same movie, but with certain other criteria, and maybe even saving in terms, I don't know, special effects, for instance, or other stuff like that, they could have concentrated more on the story. They would have made it so much cooler even the plots suck, and the fact that a plot sucks, the plot doesn't take much but artistical talent, let's be honest. So what it means here is that even the producers do not search for artistical talent anymore. The same goes for books. People don't care, I mean, publishers don't care if the book is something deep or thorough. They just care they can sell it cheaply immediately. And the same goes for movies. They're produced in a way that, according to me, they already know they're gonna cash a certain amount of money, and they just prefer to stay on that, not to invest greater resources for a greater work that, however, might not be appreciated and consume in one time more resources. And so that's a kind of defeatism. It's like as if our civilization was relaxing too much, thinking that now we can make it easier, and instead we're losing quality that is dramatically important to progress. And that's I believe that's quite of a big problem. So even the publishers, I mean, the author might be a guarantee on the quality in some ways. At least it's difficult that a stupid, let's say, it's difficult, let's say in the reverse, that a very intelligent author writes garbage. I mean, it's possible, and it's sometimes there are authors would just host someone else in the book to write some parts of it, so that basically they sponsor them through their name, which also happens effectively. But most of all, I would distrust the publisher. I mean, the publisher also has actually, well, let's be honest, even the publishers can be very good. For instance, I believe that, sadly enough, the Osprey Publishing, that I believe all people interested in military history from all levels of expertise know, because it's so popular, people know, they have dramatically improved the quality of their work. But guess what? They are going bankruptcy because they're not faring very well. At least I don't want to spread false news about Osprey Publishing, but that's because they're becoming actually quality books, and people are not interested in that so much anymore, because they start costing a little more because they have invested in it. And people say, okay, well, it's too much for my own level of interest, and I don't care, right? And maybe they sold way better the early ones that were not very good. I mean, the first Osprey publications were pretty bad sometimes, actually. But there's the ones you still find kind of around more easily. So about the reviews can be very tricky. I believe every product now you can go on the internet and find a review, and you usually find in every review basically the contrary of everything. Like for someone it's perfect, for someone it sucks. Certain tranchant judgments usually should alert you. Like, through the reviews you should be able to understand what whether this is for instance, just a number is pretty meaningful, but even the judgment, if it's very polarized, it's usually because there is, I believe, most of the time something that doesn't quite work. I mean, the excellent book is usually rare to find. I believe that there are people who are very needy and they're very picky, and they express very tranchant judgments. I'm pretty much one of them. I mean, I try usually to I don't like when people despise what is actually passable, because they don't frame it in its context, and they say just, it sucks. Well, okay, but if there are certain publications that are obviously meant to be cheap stuff, and maybe for that level of, even for that audience target, that they make a good job. Well, maybe there is someone who reads from an author and says, this is the author who's so important, so famous, is quoted by everyone, and it's not able to even read or understand the book properly. and to maybe just because it's a name they say, it's such a great thing that nobody cares why. And there is also very much this attitude of siding with an authority, so just following the herd, then approaching texts and their authors for what they are. I personally, obviously have favorite authors depending on, but I never followed them as such. I mean, I don't care most of the times, and I must confess, when I read books, the author is actually, I wish to know the least about the author as possible, especially when I read the book, because I may have prejudices eventually, and what I want to evaluate effectively is just the book. So that's what I try to do, and that's therefore why that's I believe a very healthy attitude. I mean, sometimes it can help, of course, to know what the author is, as if anything, for seeing what other things he has written. But what is important sometimes is to project yourself into a state in which you don't really care about anything but the ideas that you have absorbed, let's say, and then making an original synthesis of them. And the way I think and I tell history when I make Schwerpunkt videos is exactly this one, is that obviously I haven't been born with knowledge incorporated, and as you understand, I'm not even a particularly knowledgeable person, but I rarely follow someone's idea. I see certain history channels on YouTube where people are so thrilled because there is the person who makes a book review. The book review is fine, but at the same time, why don't you read the book? I mean, whether you're waiting for someone who tells you how the book really is, or you're really more interested in what the person really thinks in general. Of course, it can be a subjective impression about the book, a criticism, a critique, or stuff like that. But there's also this tendency of lecturing others through other authors' works. Like, I have read this work, so I'm so smart because I can quote it, and I quote it from the right guy, right? The one that rocks hard, and therefore I'm so cool, and that's it. I don't think that's great. I mean, I will definitely make at a certain point some videos about certain works, certain authors, but I still don't think that can be just like an advice, like a suggestion, but I won't be putting that author's words in my mouth just to please other people, to see that I look cool. I don't care about that. It may be a kind of destructive attitude, but you see that I rarely quote anyway, if not sources as primary sources, but the interpretations are also to be left to what you see the question like from your perspective, because that's ultimately what I believe is the sap of history in itself, is your own curiosity, your own question. So that's why history is subjective, but at the same time, in order to answer that question, you need some attention to the basis, to the fundaments, to sources, and then expanding to. So and there are definitely certain publishers that publish alternate quality stuff. Like, it's obvious, it depends on the authors sometimes, definitely. It happens pretty frequently. If you don't know anything about the publishers, well, at that point, reversing to the first elements, like just the title, how it's written apparently, or what kind of information it has. Obviously, looking even at a bibliography is usually important. Like, if you go at the end of the book and you find that there is a very few written in terms of research of books quoted, etc. It's usually not such a greatly thoroughly researched. There is a kind of an academic average that you can learn to spot. The rest is kind of generalist public publishing, and they're kind of easy to spot. Then how do I know that the book is good for me? Well, I usually, as I was saying before, I rarely even ever walk into bookstores. If I've maybe just if I have to make a gift to someone or stuff like that. But the usually I have this, as I was saying before, enormous pile of books at home, and now it's a challenge for me even to leave enough to finish reading them in the first place. So I have other existential problems from this particular point of view. I must say though that I had to buy them at a point. I mean, I had to collect them at least at a point, and it took some time actually, because sometimes I just got them because they were given to me. Other times because I searched them thoroughly. There is a great problem with books is that also let's say motivates my skepticism in general towards just basing yourself on the book is in not on what you can check elsewhere, let's say, which is that very rarely a book answers your question. I mean, it happens to me even in these tons of books to go searching fortunately most of them are digitalized actually, because otherwise I wouldn't have even space at home. I believe with 10,000 books, but it's alarming. Even my library is pretty full. I mean the physical one, so I wouldn't know where to put them. I'm kind of, well, not really surrounded by books, but I wouldn't know where else to place them at this point, even in my room. But the problem is that it's difficult to find really what you need. I mean, when you need an information, I usually even check the internet before the books. Then the internet normally gives me those names and data that I need in a very summary way, and then I go search for that into books, and I usually find something, but it's never it's usually, at least not always, about that. That's why, especially when it comes to military history, that is my field of, let's say, my specialty, if we can say that. Sometimes I'm lucky enough to have a book that is dedicated to that topic, but aside that, from the fact that certain topics are very every author has his own style, so that's there are stories that are told in ways that maybe you don't find particularly interesting. And another drama actually is the access to sources. Not all books quote sources. I mean, they obviously name them, but if you read the book proper, you're reading, as I was saying before, the interpretation of someone. You have the quote to the sources, but you sometimes don't have time, or maybe you don't even have those sources to read the sources. No, you don't even have them. So the risk you have is that you are basically following what that person is saying, and you may be wrong. So I'm actually very, very. That's also why I believe that general history is so more. It's very effective as well in parallel with hyper specialization, because in a certain sense, in spite of the different interpretations that you can have of even macroscopical events, general history is difficultly deniable in itself. I mean, I know it's plenty of people out there who deny even some of the most evident things that happen out there, but we're talking about actual history now, scientific work. And so there are so many big parts of history that you normally don't know that you can't leave out, in my opinion. So that sometimes even a good surfing on the net can have its own fruits if that gives you the, you come across things you didn't know. Let's be honest about that. It always happens like that. If you never read about a certain topic, that is gonna be foggy, because if you're asked to tell about that, you have either to improvise or to guess, or to base yourself on other things, and normally also the interest that you have is guided by this. Normally, you only tend to search for things that you already know, because it's only by knowing them that you can find something interesting to them. And that's why you tend to shoo and to keep away things that are not so important, or seem not to be important. And there are, of course, many ideological problems as well. We will have to make a video on this at one point, that how people shut their brain in many ways, or parts of their brain. Literally, actually, this is how science tells us, when it comes to things like politics, other ideologies, and certain attitudes that seem to me seem to be actually very, very powerful today as movers of interest. When I started Schwerpunkt, I had personally this very objective, that was to even exploit in part this conflictuality, and to analyze it and to understand from it what is that people are driven by when they usually learn history, because it's extremely easy to find a sectary approach to history from this point of view, that when you go search for the reason of which you realize it's normally ideologically driven. I mean, it's not because of sheer ignorance, but because it's people have decided to select willingly topics on the base of something else that actually has not to do with even factual history, and that in turn is related to history in a way or in another, either as a cause, or in this case, but also as a consequence. So these are actually very sensible pieces of information that have necessary to be taken into consideration when even understanding what is that I want to learn. That's, I think, a question we should pose ourselves way more easily. Then, of course, there is some gold out there in terms of very handy and practical material. There's not even manuals proper, because most of publications today tend in fact to dilute information, right? You have to justify the money you make the people paying for. So a very clever, but not very clever on the longer run thing, is that because you lose your credibility is to write a lot, but without saying much. So personally, I have a great taste for compendiums, for this even booklets that maybe are not even completely accurate, but that you can see they have a concentrated amount of information that you can go check from other books relatively. That's also an extremely precious source for Schwerpunkt in itself at this point, and they're definitely useful for everyone who wants to approach that even feels like military history. Are very technical, and sometimes you find approach just from broadly political and social point of view. Like most of what we name under the umbrella of military history is actually just kind of history, studying something that is somewhat related to war, actually. Yeah, but it's not effectively about war. I believe most of people know the difference between military history or the military art, for instance, or history of the military art, actually. So the point is, there is a lot of confusion that is aimed at entertaining people more than educating them. And this is the drama, and this is a drama you have to cope with, but largely by yourself. So when choosing a book, obviously it helps dramatically to have already read other books. In my opinion, I can tell you that it's also the rhythms that a bit change you, because it's like when you've never read a book, right? On a certain topic, you don't know where to start from, and what you think is that you think yourself kind of timidly in front of the topic, like you would like to learn, but you're searching for advice, and you're searching for someone who tells you how it is. But actually, it's plenty of quicker methods to find out huge amount of information, chiefly through the internet of bibliography. Every published book now is out there as a name, so you can track that pretty easily and make a simple choice and buy it on the internet. And that's probably how you should start to operate if you're really interested in deepening your knowledge on a certain topic. Naturally, you say, well, okay, but if I start from the internet, I don't see the book. Yeah, okay, you should in fact go through exactly those things you listed, like the title, the author, the publisher. Getting now there are many books you can read, like a couple of pages from the internet, and more or less spotting what's the nature of it. And so there are actually many hints that if you refine, you should be able. And I can say that the problem ceases to exist actually when you start reading them, because the other great problem is that we would all like to read a freaking lot of stuff, but objectively we don't have time. I'm personally now reading from a couple of years just the sources of my PhD. I'm not reading anything else, literally. So yeah, okay, every day I read obviously a tiny bit, even to make Schwerpunkt videos, etc. But sometimes you really don't have time, really, especially if you're engaged in a heavy intellectual work. You try to save your mental energies for something else as well, and that's dramatic, as you understand, because it's as if you really hadn't read a full book since some years. Well, I've read some books recently, but just a very few of them. And the idea is, when is that I will finally have the time to read all I want? Will I ever? And probably one of the reasons why professors sometimes are so narrow-minded is that they wish to learn more, but they didn't, because they had other things to do. But I suspect that most of the real reason is that they don't have much curiosity themselves, most of the times at least, as I've tried to explain now and also in other videos. So so I personally would choose books exclusively on the base of of these measures, of these this hints, this information you have, but especially being aware that there is the greatest wealth you can accumulate. The best book is the one you write yourself when you read so many books at once, because our brain has this incredible capacity of intertwining all the information we had to cross them and to form something original. So in other words, even reading cheap stuff, I get it. Sometimes I began to read a book and I said, okay, this is so stupid, I don't want to read it. But fortunately enough, this happened I think just once. I think a couple of years ago. It was the first time I stopped reading a book and I said, this is completely useless. I wish I hadn't but bit by bit it's all very and obviously the bibliography. Every book, history book worth of this name does have a bibliography that guides you through other books. So even if you're not satisfied with that, you can see where does this person get the information for the book from. And that's pretty useful, because every book at that point can provide you tens of books quite easily at the same time. but also some daily read of cheap stuff, even from the internet. Even I was telling before, also in other videos, even if you read, for instance, the English Wikipedia, it's not that bad actually. It's most of the times it's pretty well sourced. Of course, it's concise. It's not so deep in information. But if you really look for expanding your knowledge, broadly meant, that's actually, economically speaking, it's amazing. You can learn infinite stuff just a click away, and getting especially the essentials, because at that point that's what you need. You don't need an entire book, just like you don't need to listen to me. If you got to get just the essentials, I can make the essentials, but also you read a book when you want to know how you get to the essentials. That's how it should be, and that's why Schwerpunkt has these long videos. It's because they're meant to be to make people reasoning more than actually telling them, just do this. Because I can't answer to these questions like, just you basically, actually I think the questions were very well put, and that they were thoroughly conceived, because they already contain the answer by themselves, as it often happens when you especially pose questions to about such widespread such shared and common problems, right? And so I would say, well done. I mean, you got what the point really is. Now the thing you will have to do is to go there and try it, because also without mistakes you can't hope to do much. So I would say that we are at a good point, evidently, and it can be a good example for other people reading this question on whichever video it was. I don't remember now. But yes, and okay, so I'm sorry. Yeah, I know I haven't been concise, so I'm desolated about that. Regarding to question and answer videos, why not trying? I think it's cool that we can try this. I don't see any real problem about it. And the only thing I wanted to say now is that obviously it also takes a while to make decent videos. I have some formats now that have kind of developed. I don't know now how much Schwerpunkt will grow, because in that case maybe we'll try to expand even a little bit the quality, or to go a bit deeper into the topics. But things are faring relatively well. The growth, as I was saying, the other day, I was updating about the channel. The trend is steady. It's steadily growing, and it's fine to acknowledge it. But I still wonder whether this is expanding so much. It's just me making lots of videos, then I don't know whether people followed it, but whatever. I know when I make these videos about thematically oriented, theoretically oriented, I always remain with a sense of insatisfaction. Like when I finish to talk about an actual historical topic, I feel okay, wow, I'm fine with that. Even I may obviously criticize the way, may be unsatisfied with the way I deliver the content, but the topic gives me some satisfaction. These videos here leave me always with a lot of wondering, because these topics evidently don't have a real complete solution, but at the same time there is a common approach that is important to point out, because that's where you can solve the problem from, in part at least, in a way that is kind of normal. The problem is that the problem in itself isn't eliminable, because if we had found out the best ways to educate ourselves, we would probably be in a much better world by now. But I think it's exactly by putting out there lots of stuff that looks into the problem and not just contents itself of talking about history. Well, it can make someone progress in more, because yeah, it's the same thing I was saying before. You can read lots of books, but if you also don't think about the problems that are behind these books. And I realize also the question of, I would say that everyone has his own tricks. And I'm not talking about tricks in the sense of faking information and stuff like that, but we all have our own privileged source of information that we use and we reflect on, and it's normal. So I don't have many secrets in the way I organize. I draw informations from, or I listen to. I would just say that, however, there are. It's important to acknowledge the stages of such process of education. That's something that is very often, and that's really the philosophical stone. Right? That's really the thing that should be told, and nobody tells you. Especially when you're younger, you're starting to look at things more thoroughly, and people don't tell you that there are certain things you have to do, certain steps you have to take. I personally struggled a lot. I mean, okay, not excessively, but it's a constant problem that, as you see, I keep talking about very often at this point. And the only comfort in this, I would say, is that we're not alone in it, that we can help each other in the process, and we can share our experience and our thoughts, our opinions, and in order to make us think more. So history is amazing by itself. It's able to teach us probably way more than we can do individually to each other, but it's by itself, and it's in this that we need to have to cultivate a privileged relation with it, a personal relation with it, so that you can't escape the process of self-education. I would say there are certain things you have to prove by yourself, because otherwise, even listening to me or to anyone else that gives you gives an advice or tells an opinion, it's reductive, because you don't fully know how it really is until you don't actually figure out by yourself what it is. So, well, I don't know whether I answered the questions. Actually, I think I rambled rather too much for 2 hours now, but it's a start. I mean, even with Schwerpunkt, there's a pile of videos now in the playlist History that deal exactly with this broader philosophical, intellectual, and even quite material problems at the same time that are relevant, I believe, for at least they are for me. Then I don't know for you whether, even if you're content with my explanations, with my perspectives, I think I have a pretty average mind, or that I don't tell all this amazing stuff. But as I was saying, I hope to be at least a tiny bit of help for anyone interested in, and there is nothing specific in it, and I would stop here. So I don't know what I will make the next question and answer video. I don't know. I probably not very often, because I don't want to turn Schwerpunkt into that, but it's quite likely that it will become that in a certain point. No, I won't let it happen, I promise, but still, I foresee there will be an increasing number of questions at one point. We'll have to deal with it. So even, excuse me if I ignore some of the comments, or I try to put a like with the heart YouTube allows to the channel owner, but also I can't answer every single thing. So I try to do it at this point, but I just know that I follow, that I'm there. There's still the number of comments is contained enough for me, for reading them at least, and things will grow more complicated in the future. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.